Hi everyone. We're going to start today with chapter 9 of The Golden Bowl by Marjorie Cowley. Let's see what happens with Jomar and Zepha when they finally get to Ur. Chapter 9, Great Gate of Ur. Jomar took the food and bowed his head in gratitude. Then he and Zepha left the group. When they turned to wave farewell, they saw sheepskins already unrolled and spread out on the ground in preparation for their long-delayed rest. Jomar patted Zepha on the back. Singing to that baby was a good way to get food. That isn't why I did it, Zepha said, but I noticed they gave the food to you, not me. It's because I'm the oldest, Jomar said. Zepha shook her head. Unfair. She slipped the reed basket off her back. They're sleeping. What about us? Mother thought we'd be in Ur by nightfall, so we have no blankets, Jomar said. I'm too tired to need bedding. Without another word, Zepha shook out her loose braids, then stretched out on the ground by the side of the road. Jomar lay down beside her, cradling his head in her arms. He hummed Zepha's lullaby and sank into an exhausted sleep like the baby on his mother's shoulder. When he woke, the warmth of the new day covered him like a thin cotton blanket. He looked at Zepha still sleeping. The strain on her face had been smoothed away by rest. Wake up, Zepha. The sun god begins his ride across the sky. Zepha gave a small moan and sat up. She ran her hands through her hair and began braiding it. Father was right. Her long black hair no longer shone. He touched her shoulder gently. Your song helped me get to sleep. Zepha smiled. It was almost the same lullaby I sing to my favorite pig after it was born. Instead of black-eyed baby boy, I used to sing pink-eyed pretty pig. He smiled back at her and then realized that this was the first time on their journey that he had done so. They started out again, but now they were not alone on the rutted road. Where had these people been last night? Had they too slept by the side of the road or bedded down in empty fields? Most of the travelers going toward the city were raw-boned single men carrying heavy burdens on their shoulders. Looking slightly more prosperous, a few men walked beside loaded wooden carts pulled by small, straining donkeys. The families with dawdling young children traveled slowly. The people moving in the opposite direction looked defeated, their shoulders hunched and their eyes upon the road. Seeing the children reminded Jomar of his first trip to Ur. When he was a little boy, his father had taken him to the great temple to watch the ceremonies that greeted the new year. He remembered his father's comforting hand on his shoulder as they walked toward the city. Like the fragment of a long-ago dream, he recalled the splendor of the celebration, the sacrifice of a great bull with gold-tipped horns, and the throngs of joyous people. He looked around him. Now weary travelers on the road were seeking relief from their failing farms. Zepha brought Jomar out of his reverie. What food did they give us last night? Jomar untied the food pouch, and they greedily ate the smelly goat cheese, briny olives, and 2 wrinkled plums. They cracked open the husks of pistachio nuts with their teeth and spit out the empty shells as they walked. The meal was meager. To distract himself from his persistent hunger, Jomar searched the land stretching far ahead. Zepha, look, he said, coming to a halt. In the heat-hazed distance, the tan-colored earth rose up from the flat plain and took the shape of a mud-brick wall that wrapped itself around the city. This is the wall that guards the temple of the moon god and all the wealth of Ur. They started walking again, but the strained expression on Zepha's thin face returned, and her feet dragged. Others on the dusty road began to pass them. Walk faster, Jomar told her impatiently. Everyone must speak to the gatekeeper to see if they can enter the city. We don't want to lose our place. As they neared the wall, Zepha pointed to a group of tattered men, women, and children clustered close to it. They're not waiting in line. What are they doing there? Wait, I'll find out, Jomar said. Coming closer, he found crude shelters huddled against the wall that offered some protection from the blistering sun, but no privacy. Jomar spoke with a gaunt man with sad eyes, who told him they were offering themselves as slaves in return for food and a place to sleep. Jomar returned to Zepha. They're hoping to be hired by those who live inside the city, he told her. Zepha clutched his arm. Promise me you'll stay with me no matter what happens. Jomar peered in his sister's frightened face. I promise. Aware of other travelers trying to pass them, Jomar steered Zepha toward the small kiosk that bulged out from the wall. Inside was the man who determined the fate of all who would enter the city. The sun bore down as they stood in the long, snaking line of people. Children grew quarrelsome with waiting. The odor of anxious, exhausted travelers merged with the sweat of burdened donkeys. From the front of the slowly moving line, angry or pleading voices could be heard, but not the words of the gatekeepers. "Let me in! My whole family starves in the countryside." "I'm a skilled carpenter, and my wife's an excellent cook." "Unfair! The city depends on us for food, but abandons us when times are bad." Jomar and Zephyr were almost at the gatehouse. How many people were getting in? From the steady stream of dazed and stony faces being turned away, not many. "Who are you, and what is your business in Ur?" the gatekeeper asked in a droning voice, as they finally stood before him. Jomar straightened his shoulders. "I'm Jomar, son of Durabi. My father made an arrangement with a goldsmith who works for the temple. I'm to be his new apprentice." The man gestured toward the gate. "Then enter." He looked at Zephyr. "And this young girl?" Zephyr's strong fingers gripped Jomar's arm. "She's my sister," Jomar said, in a voice that seemed too loud. The gatekeeper looked at Jomar, narrowed his lips, and waited for him to continue. "And," he snapped, "where will she live? What will she do?" Jomar's tongue seemed stuck to the roof of his parched mouth. The people behind them grumbled impatiently. "We're waiting. Hurry up," someone called out. "Speak," the gatekeeper said. My sister's a musician," Jomar stammered. "We have temple musicians," the man said irritably, "and we don't need any more hungry young players roaming the streets." Jomar snatched Zephyr's lyre from her basket and held it up. "A toy," the gatekeeper snorted. "No, not a toy," Zephyr said firmly, and took the lyre from Jomar's hand and held it in position. "This is no place for a concert," a young man behind them said angrily. But Zephyr moved her fingers over the lyre's strings and began a hymn to the sun god in a breathy, nervous tone. "Ungat Nana, your son we glorify. Each dawn you send us Utu in his chariot golden bright, pulled by 4 prancing steeds that surge across the sky. Utu battles darkness to defeat the night. Bold Utu battles darkness to give us morning light." Jomar watched the gatekeeper's scowl of contempt disappear as Zephyr's voice steadied and soared as she sang. He heard people murmuring behind them. "Her music honors Utu," a strong voice rang out. "Let her in." The gatekeeper leaned toward Jomar and spoke in a troubled whisper. "I could lose my position if the temple officials find out what I've done, but I'll allow your sister to enter the city. You must not speak of her skills to anyone, lest she be pressed to join one of the bands of music-making beggars." He gestured with his thumb toward the open gates. "Go, but keep her safe, off the streets." Chapter 10. City Made of Mud. Pulling Zephyr behind him, Jomar almost danced with relief as they walked toward the gateway. "You were brave to sing for the gatekeeper. I would never have thought to ask you to do that." "I know. That's why I decided to sing my song," Zephyr said quietly. As they moved through the immense wooden doors, Jomar wondered where the timber came from and how it got there. The noises of the city, loud cries, snatches of music, the hum of conversation, the scrape of wooden cartwheels, came from every direction. People of all ages and manner of dress surged around them. Staring at an elegant woman, Zephyr stopped and stood, rooted. The woman wore a tight gown that left one shoulder bare, and her coiled braids were wound twice around her head. When they were jostled by impatient people trying to get around them, Jomar grasped Zephyr's arm again and moved her forward. The delicious scent of onions and spices filled the air, as well as the more pungent odors of raw fish and mutton. Jomar and Zephyr stood on tiptoe to see over the crush of milling people. Stalls and tables were jammed into the slender shadow of the city's wall, and a boundless array of goods lay spread out on the tables or hung from hooks. "Pierced shells to decorate your finest clothes. Ivory buttons and pearls from the sea sold here," a vendor shouted. "I've never seen pearls before," Zephyr whispered to Jomar. "They glisten like little moons." "My final offer," a gruff voice rang out from the crowd. "I'll give you half your asking price for 5 buttons that I doubt are really ivory." Another vendor spoke in a coaxing tone. Here's a lapis lazuli necklace to bring joy to your wife. Zephyr gazed at the strange blue beads flecked with yellow that the merchant held up high. How Mother would love that necklace, she said. A high-pitched woman's voice cried out, The sweetest honey-baked cakes and the best barley bread in are here. Jomar's stomach rumbled. There was so much food here. Had all the grain, all the honey, all the meat come from the countryside where farmers starved? When Zephyr reached out toward the loaves of bread stacked on a table, the vendor impatiently shooed her hand away as if it were a fly. Jomar was stung by this rudeness. Where did the baker think the barley came from? He suddenly saw himself as a young boy. Wet with sweat, he ran behind his father's plow to remove clods of dirt from the new furrows so that the tender barley seeds could sprout. Leaving the baker, they heard tinny music. A small band of thin, raggedy children were playing a lute, rattles, a reed pipe, and a tambourine. When Zephyr stopped to listen, they gathered in front of her to sing and play a lively tune that repeated 2 strong beats followed by a pause. At the end of the song, the boy with the tambourine turned it over and held it out. Close to tears, Zephyr said, I've nothing to give you. The children's gaunt faces fell. Then they scurried away. Come on, Jomar said briskly. We should find the goldsmith's house as soon as possible. Zephyr dragged her feet. I won't be welcome there. You'll get a meal at least, Jomar said. And then? Zephyr asked, her voice trailing off. And then I don't know, Jomar sighed. Father told me Sida and his wife live in back of the temple. We must be close to it, he said, with forced conviction. He hurried Zephyr along, careful to keep out of the way of bustling people and laden donkeys. They came upon a bridge that was crowded with people looking down at a large canal at the bottom of steep earthen walls. Even from a distance they could sense the excitement of those people packed together on the bridge. Coming closer, they heard fragments of conversation. Killing a free man is serious, a prosperous-looking man said. Better if he'd been a slave. A shabbily dressed young man responded, Slave or free, let him drown if he's guilty. A mother holding her baby spoke up. He says he didn't do it, so let the river decide. Hearing the animated talk, Zephyr shuddered. I don't want to go any closer. Then stay here, Jomar said. I'm going to find out what's happening. He spoke briefly to a woman carrying a basket of dried fish, then returned to Zephyr. A man charged with killing another man will be thrown into the canal, Jomar said. If he comes to the surface and manages to get out of the canal, he'll be judged innocent. And if he drowns, they believe that he's guilty. He shook his head. I've never heard of such a cruel custom. Zephyr looked sharply at him. You sound like you don't believe in the test. When Jomar didn't answer her challenge, she sighed and let him lead her away from the bridge. The next street they tried was a jumble of mud-colored brick houses and shops. Most of the buildings were squat like their own farmhouse, but they walked by a 2-storied house with jutting balconies that was surrounded by fruit trees and flowering bushes. Zephyr slowed down. This looks like a palace from one of the stories that Mother used to tell me, all about the adventures of god-kings. Her voice trembled. I want to go home. Jomar took Zephyr's arm. Keep walking. Disoriented and hungry, they wandered through the streets of the city until they stood in front of the temple. It was far larger and more complex than Jomar remembered, and so sprawling it looked like a city within a city. Pillars and buttresses soared out of the tawny earth. Mud brick walls gleamed with small cones of black, red, and white that formed precise patterns of zigzags, spirals, and triangles. Confident people, dressed in linen and sheepskin, climbed the stairs toward huge wooden double doors. This is where the moon god lives, Jomar said. His home is grander than any palace from one of Mother's stories. As they circled the temple, they found clusters of mud brick houses and shops jammed against the temple walls and one another. Jomar stopped a man leading a donkey piled with pottery. Do you know where the goldsmith Sida lives? Never heard of him, the man said. When 3 more people gave Jomar the same answer, Jomar grasped how big the city was. The people in his village would have known the name and whereabouts of everyone who lived there, or in the surrounding farms. Jomar kept asking about Sida until an old woman wordlessly pointed out a small brick house on the narrow street that looked the same as all the others. When they got closer, Jomar saw that the design of a tool had been deeply etched into a brick placed above the door. It was a tool he was unfamiliar with. This must be the mark of the goldsmith. The door to the house was open. They could smell cooked cabbage and onions. With Zeppa clutching his arm, Jomar stepped over the threshold. And that's where we'll end for today.